My Lord and my God, I firmly believe that you're here, that you see me, that you hear me. I adore you with profound reverence. I ask your pardon for my sins and grace to make this time of prayer fruitful. My Mother Immaculate, Saint Joseph, my Father and Lord, my guardian angel, intercede for me. My grandmother had at the back of her house, just looking out through the kitchen window, a small garden, which was literally her pride and joy. And my grandparents lived on a farm in the middle of the countryside, and surrounded by fields as the house was, this little garden at the back was very well cared for. It kind of stood in contrast to the wild grass that grew all around it, where the cows could take pasture. And Granny would care for that garden with a lot of love and a lot of attention. There were little kind of lawns that were divided out by a little path and a round bed in the middle. And the lawns were hard to cut. I remember as a teenager having to help her whenever she wasn't really so able to use the lawnmower again. And whilst I would have been quite happy to just kind of throw it roughly around, she made sure I got into every corner. Another thing about the garden was that, given the fact it was in the countryside, it was always under threat from rabbits. And Granny used to plant little flowers, which again just brought so much joy to her life and those who would come to visit her and see from the kitchen window these flowers growing. But the rabbits liked the flowers just as much as Granny did. And there was a kind of a constant battle that went on to protect the garden from children, number one, but also from the rabbits. And there were all kind of devices that were procured to try and scare away the rabbits from the flowers, which didn't really, to my mind, seem terribly effective, because we were forever having to run and chase rabbits as they invariably made their way into the garden. Now, I say all of this because this is a great example for me of how Granny looked after something that she cared for very much, and she put a lot of effort and a lot of attention into protecting something which was very dear to her heart. In the same way that it could be anything. It could even be our family, or maybe a particular piece of work that we're engaged in. The point is that when something is very close to our heart, we will put a lot of effort into ensuring that it is well protected and that we'll do it well. And this comes to my mind because today we celebrate the feast of St. Maria Goretti, who was a young girl who died for love of Jesus, but specifically for her love of her purity. And it's something that stands as a great witness today, because we live in a world which is kind of sunk into impurity at times. We live in a world where modesty and prudence seem to have at times gone out the window. And so we need the examples of these great saints to remind us of the virtues to which you are calling us to live, Jesus. It's appropriate, I think, that for today's Mass, the ordinary readings come from the Gospel that speaks to us about the call of the disciples. And we have the names of these great disciples. And these men are truly fundamental pillars for our church. And we rest upon them because they were the ones who learned directly from you, Jesus, and in turn their preaching and their example helped and supported others. But there are many examples of apostolic witnesses who didn't live, let's say, to the same fame or extent as the apostles, but who, through their love of you, Jesus, and through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, have been able to inspire and to support the church in many beautiful ways. And one of those examples is Maria Goretti. Now, she was a young girl. She was just 11 years old whenever she died. She lived in a very poor family in Italy, south of Rome. And there she was forced to live, because of poverty, with another family. And there was another boy in the family who was older than Maria, who did not love her but lusted after her. And he was not able to control himself at times, even to the extent of taking a knife to try and force her into being amorous with him in order to be physically in love with him. And she resisted those attempts as best she could, but he was very persistent. Now, we might at times find ourselves struggling with sins of purity or sins of impurity, let's say. And we might find ourselves a little bit like this guy who's unable to control ourselves in different moments. And we see what happens whenever, let's say, the lack of control takes over and we don't apply the brakes early on, because on one particular occasion he felt himself so unable to control himself that he took a knife again and tried to force himself upon Maria Goretti that she would make love to him. But even as a young girl, her deep love of purity, to be completely and totally given to you, Jesus, and not to give her heart away so foolishly and so carelessly, made her refrain from doing anything which was imprudent or impure. And even though she was being forced to do something against her will, and indeed at a particular moment that her life was at threat, she resisted that even still. And so this young man, who was so overcome with his passions and unable to control himself, took that knife and he stabbed Maria Goretti very violently with it, to the extent that she became desperately unwell. In fact, that she was brought to the point of dying. She didn't die instantly, and she was brought on a very painful journey to the hospital, where she later died. But throughout that whole journey, where her last hours were filled with pain and suffering, she gave that all to you, Jesus, as a sacrifice of pure love, which in a sense links very much how she lived her life. She was a child who was devoted to you in purity, and that purity manifested itself in refraining from sinful deeds, but also in able to offer up all of the difficult moments of her life. And this is how we see that all of the virtues are kind of connected, that whenever we try to live one virtue well, be it purity or be it prudence, whatever it is, that we find that we can live other virtues equally well. And so this should inspire us as well, to know that maybe if at times we're struggling with purity or struggling with different virtues in our life or lack of virtues, that look, if we put all the effort into trying to be more virtuous, it all balances out, because this is the effect of grace in our soul. And so Maria was able to offer all of these sufferings to Jesus because she was someone who was pure. She was someone who was completely and totally devoted to you. And she died as a martyr in a sense, because she was a martyr for purity. And she gave witness to you through her love for you, Jesus, but also through the witness of her very life, that she preferred to die rather than to be impure. Now, she is a great example to us, in the same way that the apostles, whose names we have at the Mass today, are great examples to us, because her witness is so strong. She was a child. When we think, what could an 11-year-old really have to teach us today? We often look at children and think they're kind of immature, or they don't know any better. But here we find one who was perfectly capable of being gallant and perfectly capable of living out her faith, to an extent which was even greater than that of the older boy who was forcing himself upon her, but perhaps even greater than many of us who are much older than Maria Goretti. Let the little children come to me, Jesus says, and that unless we humble ourselves and become like a little child, we will not enter the kingdom of heaven. And here we see perfectly in Maria Goretti. And so we too should humble ourselves to try to take on that spiritual childhood, that even if we find ourselves much older in life, to become like a little child in your arms, Jesus, would be such a wonderful thing that would help us very much to live the virtue of purity. And the other thing is that she was very devout, that all of the pious practices and all of her prayer that had become such a strong, stable part of her life had helped her at the supreme moment whenever all of that was put to the test. In other words, we can't expect that we're just going to be able to give supreme witness unless there's a good background behind it. We have to build up the supply of grace in our souls. So we have to look for opportunities, Jesus, to love you and to show our love for you in concrete and practical ways, and to increase within our souls a great love for you, which is born out of devotion, little pious practices, prayers, but also little offerings. She did so much at such a young age, and she stands as one who is such a powerful, towering example to us of the great love for purity. May she help and inspire us today, especially all of our young people, to live the virtues of purity and to love you, Jesus, with all our heart, mind, and soul. I give you thanks, my God, for the good resolutions, affections, and inspirations that you've communicated to me during this meditation. I ask your help to put them into effect. My Mother Immaculate, St. Joseph, my Father and Lord, my guardian angel, intercede for me.